Hello, and welcome to Shakespeare in Context with Claire, and a Happy New Year to you all. It's a year since I launched my channel, Shakespeare in Context, with my first YouTube video, Twelfth Night. In my videos, I've tried to present the plays in context, with the aid of historical documents. I would like to share with you some of the thoughts following my first year of research for these videos, bringing together some common themes, including some points that I might have missed. My thanks to all those who have engaged with my work and commented. All comments are welcome. So as usual, let's start with some dates. Nobody knows when any of Shakespeare's plays were written. There is no dated letter from Shakespeare saying, "I have just finished my Midsummer Night's Dream," or from his contemporaries saying, "Have you finished that play about the magician Prospero?" Traditional dating is based roughly on a system of 2 plays a year between the dates that will have been in London. By taking a more open-minded approach and not being constrained by a certain time frame, the dating of the plays can be more flexible. This is the approach that Kevin Galvari has taken in his book Dating Shakespeare's Plays. We are able to give a before date, performance or publishing. The earliest date is a little bit more tricky to pin down. For example, A Midsummer Night's Dream was published in 1600, but it has already been sundry times publicly acted. If we consider the next best-selling author after Shakespeare, Agatha Christie, we could say that she wrote 1 or 2 books a year, whereas J.K. Rowling spent years developing a theme for a whole series of books which began in 1990. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the first book, was published, whilst the last book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, was published in 2007. But the last chapter of the last book was written around 1990. So books can be years in the writing. Plays are even less straightforward. They are written, performed, and then maybe changed to suit different audiences, different actors. There is ample evidence that plays were rewritten and updated to include current events. So what are the clues that allow us to date the 5 plays that I've covered? There are allusions to the plays in books, letters and diaries of the time. One of the most important is Francis Mere's Palladi's Tamia, which mentions titles familiar to us and one which is not so familiar. Is Love Labour's Lost a lost play with a different title, such as You Like It? Some of the allusions to plays use the name of leading characters in place of title. These present some of the difficulties for dating. Sources can help us, particularly if an English translation appears at the same time. But there is a which came first dilemma, and even if an English translation does exist, there is often evidence that Shakespeare uses the original translation of the work in Latin, Italian, French and Greek. A far more interesting way of dating plays is by allusions to current events. Suitors to Queen Elizabeth appear to be alluded to quite obviously in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Twelfth Night, and perhaps less so in As You Like It. The cold, wet summer that Titania talks about can only be the summer of 1594, according to weather records from the 16th century. The play was then performed for a wedding in late 1594, early 1595. This would seem to give us firm evidence for dating. But why does the play allude to the marriage negotiations which concluded in 1581? A new play that so strongly alluded to the failed marriage negotiations performed before the 60-year-old queen at a wedding of one of her goddaughters would surely go down like a lead balloon. So I speculate that this was a skit written circa 1580 to please the queen, and then transformed over the following 14 years, or 14 years later, to include the details of bad weather in the past year. Maintaining the unities of time and space was used commonly in plays in France and Italy in the 1570s. It later Philip Sidney, in an Apology for Poetry, 1583, complains that the English plays are ignoring the classical unities. The Comedy of Errors, thought to be an early play, perhaps the earliest comedy, respects the unities, as does the Tempest, whereas Midsummer seems to bend the rules slightly, keeping the action to 24 hours, but taking place in two very different worlds, the ordered cosmopolitan city of Athens and the unruly wild forest. Let's explore some of the themes further. There's a storm at sea, and twins become separated. Mistaken identity leads to confusion, which is complicated by love at first sight. A duke has been exiled. His daughter falls in love at first sight. The young people wander off into the forest. One of them changes their appearance. There is confusion when someone falls in love with a person in disguise. It all gets sorted out in the end. Sometimes a spirit or a fairy acts as a guide. The lost have been found, the separated are reunited, all is forgiven. There is a wedding feast and they all live happily ever after. Okay, this is a simplistic summary, but it illustrates some of the themes that connect these plays. Let's look how politics and religious unrest influenced the plays. England had had over 100 years of strife. The Wars of the Roses, or the Cousins' War as it was known at the time, had finally been settled at Bosworth Field. Richard III was defeated by Henry Tudor. If the princes had died in the Tower, the next legitimate heir to the throne was the eldest child, Elizabeth of York. There had been a scandal in the House of York when the childless Richard III planned to marry his niece Elizabeth of York, while his wife Anne lay dying. Elizabeth Woodville, former queen, plotted with Margaret Beaufort for her daughter to marry Margaret's son Henry Tudor. After Henry Tudor won the battle, he married Elizabeth, uniting the two houses. Henry had a weak claim to the throne. My biggest what-if in history is that if Elizabeth of York, as the eldest child of the former king, with no living brothers, had claimed the throne in her own right, supported by her husband Henry Tudor, would their son Henry VIII be so keen to sire a son? If his mother had been more assertive queen regnant rather than a queen consort, perhaps Henry would have been more inclined that the throne of England would be safe in the hands of his daughter. During Queen Elizabeth I's reign, she was not safe. Henry had turned the country upside down with his Reformation. Mary had caused further turmoil in returning England to a Catholic state and burning Protestants. Under Elizabeth, the country was Protestant again. The majority of the country was illiterate. They couldn't read the Latin text. The Bible stories and saints had been whitewashed from the church walls. During Henry's reign, groups of players roamed the country putting on plays depicting the stories from the Bible. The passion plays and the mystery plays of Catholic England were now outlawed. But what would replace them? England was in need of new plays to replace the Catholic plays. Elizabeth's plays in their youth now turned to the classical Latin and Greek source material. In 1569, Oxford was given the Geneva Bible, which he annotated. Also in this year, he was bought Chaucer, Plutarch, folio editions of Cicero and Plato, two books in Italian, and Thomas Underdown dedicated his translation of the Ethiopian history of Heliodorus to him. He had grown up with his uncle translating Ovid's Metamorphoses. I have a feeling that de Vere, in his early attempts at playwriting, lent heavily on some of the Christian traditions of the plays performed on feast days and holidays. The characters lost wandering in confusion, become found, become led to forgiveness and mercy and reconciliation. The Tempest grapples with themes of Christianity. The actors travel through a maze like pilgrims, walking the labyrinth in medieval churches, finding their way. Midsummer also seems to reflect the Christian maze. They are led out of darkness into the light when all is forgiven. Can sickness and deformity be cured with praise? Is it better, or is punishment the best medicine against evil? This passage from the Virginia pamphlet seems to reflect the themes of the tragical comedy The Tempest. In my presentation, I did miss a major source for The Tempest, Richard Eden's Tempest. Richard Eden's Decades of the New World, 1555, which I am now going to flash up in big red letters. The earliest recorded performance of plays covered so far seemed to fall on Christian holidays, performed at court or at academic institutions. In an essay published in the Oxfordian in 2021, Catherine Children argues the case for Prospero being modelled on Lord Prospero Visconti of Milan. Although I don't disagree with her, the physician Prospero de Foligno that Oxford would have certainly known about, and who was in Venice at a good fit for the Prospero character. This finding, in Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, of nearly an exact phrase, is used by Medea as she calls upon the elements to provide her with the herbs for a magic potion. This seems to fit with my interpretation of the Tempest. Being about healing, particularly the use of medicinal herbs. The Tempest is alluded to in Sir Philip Sidney's Defence of Poesy, thought to be written around 1583, suggesting that the Tempest was from court. This also fits with the ongoing squabbling between the two men. Children also cites 8 other possible allusions to the Tempest prior to Oxford's death in 1604. I'm not sure whether this has any particular religious significance, or whether this just reflects the dates of public holidays when plays were more likely to be put on, but I suspect that these new plays were performed on the traditional dates the mystery plays were most commonly performed. The first recorded performance in the absence of a publication gives us evidence that these plays were in existence by these dates. We cannot infer that these plays were newly written for the occasion. They may have been written years before. Perhaps some historical evidence can give it. From 1572 to 1580, the Queen was entertaining French diplomats to negotiate marriage with the young French Prince Francois. Edward de Vere entertained the diplomats before his trip to Italy and spent time at the French court on his return journey. He would have been well placed to write skits and entertainment for the Queen, parodying her courtiers and her guests, even the Queen herself. There may have been an entertainment where the Queen was depicted as goddess and fairy Queen Titania. The fairy king was named after Oberon, the king of the elves in the medieval French epic poem Juan de Bordeaux. The story was popular in England in the 1500s, following the translation into English by John Bouchier, Lord Berners, circa 1540. Another skit might have featured the French ambassadors putting on a play of Pyramus and Thisbe in their pidgin English. Even though the English court would have been fluent in French, I'm not sure whether the French delegation would have been as accomplished in English. Shakespeare aimed to raise the profile of the English people to a prominent language in Renaissance Europe. By the time he reached the age of 20, Oxford was praised for his great intellect and his ability in music and the arts. An accomplished dancer and jouster, he delighted the Queen and became a favourite at court. He married Anne Cecil, who was formerly betrothed to Sir Philip Sidney. After his continental tour, Oxford returns, refusing to see his wife, but spending time entertaining the Queen. Robert Dudley and his nephew, Philip Sidney, opposed the French match. Tensions between Sidney and Oxford worsened. Oxford was influenced by commedia dell'arte, a form of Italian theatre, and some script and some improvisation. The improvisation is used to comment about current affairs. The characters often imitate the people in the locality. The 5 plays that I have discussed in my videos all seem to reflect some aspect of the late 1570s and 1580. At around 1580, Oxford was making fun of poor Sir Christopher Hatton, who was favoured by the Queen for his dancing. You can just imagine Edward de Vere, who dressed in an extravagant Italian style, persuading poor Hatton to wear yellow cross-gartered stockings, then having a good laugh about it. The servant, Abraham Fleming, lists a pleasant conceit of Vere, Earl of Oxford, discontented at the rising of a mean gentleman in the English court, circa 1580, and appears to recall the lampooning of the ambitious courtier Christopher Hatton, as Malvolio in Twelfth Night. At the same time, Oxford's servant Anthony Munday described how a brave and comely ship brought in before her Majesty, wherein were certain of her noble lords, and this ship was made with gallant device, that in her presence it ran upon her, was the bravest device that I ever saw, and worthy of innumerable commendations. Oxford was said to have danced his way from the wrecked ship to Her Majesty and handed her a jewel. In a letter to the King of France in 1580, entertainment was described as une belle comédie qui se conclut par un mariage. So we have a lavish entertainment involving a shipwreck and an entertainment ending in marriage. This could refer to Twelfth Night, the Tempest, or even the Comedy of Errors. In the skeleton of the plot there is a shipwreck. People become separated, confusion reigns until everyone comes together at the end and finds a resolution. In addition to the lavish entertainment at court, people entertain themselves with writing poems. One person might write a poem, and then another would write a response. This could either be in the form of gallant love poetry or witty banter poetry, one-upmanship. I am sure that there was some fun to be had imitating handwriting and leaving witty coded messages for people like Hatton. There was a war of words between Philip Sidney and Oxford. Philip Sidney prided himself on his gallantry. He didn't like this trend of breaking ice, and he didn't like the style of the euphuistic poets like Oxford and his servants. The 25-year-old Philip Sidney fell in love with his 16-year-old Penelope Devereux. You could just imagine him writing her romantic love poetry and pinning them on trees in some sort of pastoral romance, then Oxford replacing them with silly badly written. He was forced to marry someone else, and poor Sir Philip never got over it. Philip Sidney died in 1586, and Christopher Hatton died in 1591. It would seem irrelevant, not to mention bad taste, to lampoon these men after they died. Another link to the 1580 date are the 2 ships, the Tiger and the Phoenix, mentioned in Twelfth Night, which were active around this time. Has the riddle of Maria's letter been solved? I'm not convinced, but just to put it out there, this is one of the simplest solutions that I have found. I am O. I'll put some links below if you would like more. In 1581, Anne Vavasor, one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, gave birth to de Vere's son. Edward was thrown in the Tower. Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, is under arrest. He has spent the last decade learning about theatre during his travels, whilst providing lavish entertainments for the Queen. He now has all the time in the world to put pen to paper. The loosely scripted entertainment about shipwreck became 3 separate plays, one a farce, one a romance, and one a tragical comedy. Whilst his little skits about the Queen and her becomes a dream, separate stories woven together. The plays aren't published at this time. They're put to one side for a later date. During the cold, stormy summer of 1594, Oxford sits writing by candlelight. Even at this time of year, the skies are dark outside the window of his home, King's Place. He is thinking about a play to present for his daughter Elizabeth's wedding next year. He thought about her refusal to marry the Earl of Southampton. She has fallen in love with an equally Earl of Derby. He brings out his dream play, Remembering his time spent in the little town of Sabbionetta, known as Little Athens, he makes it the setting for the opening of his play. The temple in Sabbionetta would be a perfect location for the wedding at the end of the play. Names of famous Athenian heroes for his characters. The young lady Hermia refuses to marry Demetrius, the man her father has chosen for her. She argues that Lysander is a man of equal status. The young lovers plan to run off to the forest together. They are bound to get lost, especially if they are misled by an impish spirit. He thinks back to the time in exile from court. The Queen's anger could make the whole world seem cold, like the icy winds and rain during this summer, the coldest in living memory. He gives Titania a new speech about the cold frost on the summer rose and the terrible storms and floods. He hopes that by the time of the wedding, this summer would just seem like a bad dream. He has just finished rewriting a comedy of errors for the Christmas festivities at Gray's Inn. He has stuffed it full of farce, slapstick humour and legal language to amuse the student lawyers. His other play, much like Comedy of Errors or Menechmi, about twins, had been popular with the audience at court, particularly Ambroso de Venezia and the 5 Venetian brothers, musicians to the Queen. Oxford's Italian boy, with the voice of an angel, his perfect viola, returned to Italy for fear that he would be persuaded to convert to the Protestant belief held by the Queen. When asked by the Inquisition whether the Lord Oxford had tried to persuade him to change faith, he replied, "The Lord Oxford said, 'Do what you will.'" The actors emulated the courtly customs and genteel behaviour that he had learned from Castiglione. He thought back to the preface that he had written in Latin when he had only just attained his majority, and how he had vowed to aid his prince by speaking truth to power, whether by jest like Feste, and a loud fool, or plain speaking like Viola, who no longer sang like the eunuch first presented to Duke Orsino in the earlier version of the play. His alma mater, Cambridge University, had also requested a play, rewriting it with precise, well-chosen words and skillfully constructed crystal-clear sentences, and with every art of dignity. It would be a fitting tribute to his young friend the Earl of Essex on the occasion of his master's degree ceremony, attended by the Queen. The young man, approaching his 30th birthday, was now the Queen's favourite. Adopted by her as a ward of court, brought up in William Cecil's household, Robert de Vere, 2nd Earl of Essex, reminded Edward of himself as an arrogant, headstrong youth. Now older and wiser, Oxford worried that his young friend would one day go too far. He knew that testing the Queen's patience was a sure way to end up in the Tower. Okay, so this is starting to fall into the realm of historical fiction, but it illustrates the difficulty of dating Shakespeare's plays. It would explain why people have difficulty in deciding whether a play is naive or mature, when it could be both. There is no recorded performance of The Tempest until after de Vere's death, 1923, although allusions to it by de Vere's contemporaries suggest that it was frequently performed prior to that. After his death, the manuscript passed on to Oxford's daughter, Susan Herbert, Countess of Montgomery. Her brother-in-law, William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, and Sir Francis Bacon were close friends who were interested in the colonisation of the Americas. Francis Bacon was a council member for the Virginia Company from 1609. Might he have had something to do with the anonymous Virginia pamphlet of 1610, a true declaration of the estate of the colony in Virginia, which is closely linked to the performance of a play called The Tempest, was in November 1611 in the presence of King James at Whitehall? Would Francis Bacon have had access to Oxford's manuscripts for the Herberts? I think that there is a strong possibility that he was involved in the editing process to bring the plays to publication in 1623. 1594 was the first year that Thomas Creed worked as an independent printer, after establishing his print shop in 1593. One of the first books printed by Creed, Gwyddonius the Card of Fancy, was dedicated to Oxford. After these books were printed, Creed employed his trademark on most of the books connected with Shakespeare or de Vere. The device bears the inscription Virescit vulnere veritas. Truth grows in injury. It doesn't take much imagination to see Vere repeated 3 times, or to see the use of double V, which Oxford was known to use in signing his messages. In 1598, Creed printed the most delectable and pleasant history of Parismus, a prose romance that could be described as a novella. I will put a link to it below. It makes fun reading, although it has been likened to Twelfth Night, due in part to a queen named Olivia and a shipwreck. On reading, I thought there were more similarities to As You Like It. One of the main characters, Violetta, falls in love with Parismus, who is in love with Laurana. Parismus, best friend, Polypus, falls in love with Violetta, who dresses up as a boy called Adonis in order to join Parismus on his travels. Parismus stays true to Laurana. Polypus stays true to Violetta. In Violetta's absence, Adonis does. Well, I think you can see where this story is heading, so I won't spoil the ending for those of you who would like to read it. The 4 lovers bear a resemblance to the 4 young Athenian lovers in Midsummer Night's Dream. The island of dark rocks ruled by a pirate could be said to resemble Island. The romantic prose is written in the euphuistic style by a writer with no biography, simply styled E. Ford. There is so much more I could say about this book. I will have to come back to it at a later date. Many thanks to those of you who have left comments. This is one of my favourites. Since launching my channel last year, I have had over 2,700 views, which isn't bad for a newcomer. Thank you to those who have subscribed to my channel. I started the year with the intention of getting a video out every month, but life takes over. I would like to be able to tell you that I will do better in 2024, but alongside my everyday job, I'm also working as a tutor in Cardiff University 1 day a week. Even though my time is limited, I have much better access to reading materials. As you can imagine, each play requires many hours of research as I try and weed out the documented facts from the long-held fictions. I hope you have enjoyed this year's roundup, allowing me to weave my own narrative around some of the documented facts. Next up will be Much Ado About Nothing. I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas. The best way to contact me is through Facebook. You will find me at Shakespeare, Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, Shakespeare by Another Name. This is a private group, so get in touch with Shelley, tell her about your interest in de Vere, Shakespeare, and why you would like to join. All genuine seekers of truth about Shakespeare are welcome. Please press the like button, and if you haven't already joined, please subscribe and press the bell icon to receive notifications. Please, and remember, please be kind.